Hello everybody, welcome to A British Audiophile. Just like to talk a little bit briefly about these podcasts that I've been doing over the last few weeks. My intention is to have a variety of guests on and some regular contributors. So this is the fourth podcast that I'm doing. The first one I did was with Brian at eAcoustics, the founder of eAcoustics, and the second one was Ian White, who's the editor-in-chief at eAcoustics. And the nice thing about that is that I can talk at things with them from an industry perspective, from a reviewer's perspective, and hopefully you get some insight from things from behind the scenes. The third podcast that I did was with Ben at ATC, and ATC produced some of the finest speakers in the world. And even though that particular podcast was quite generic, what I like about that is that I can, in future episodes, delve into specific topics in quite a bit of detail. Some of the questions that I really wanted to ask, and perhaps you may want to ask industry experts. Today, I have something a little bit different again. I'm joined here with Siddharth, and Siddharth is one of my contributors and supporters on Patreon, and we can look at things from a viewer's perspective. My intention is that these podcasts should appeal to people at different points in their journey. So I'd just like to welcome Siddharth. Siddharth's also kindly agreed to be a regular contributor on the channel and help me behind the scenes. Thank you for being here, Siddharth.
Hey, Taryn, thanks for having me. It's fun.
Yeah. So Siddharth supports me on Patreon, and your day job, you're still at work, aren't you, at the moment?
Yes, I am. I am in the office because I am a professor of computer science by trade. And because of the pandemic, they made us all have a good recording equipment set up in the office. And I thought, hey, why not double dip, right? So I could use this to record a podcast. So here I am. And I'm fairly a fledgling audiophile, if I could call myself that. And through this experience and through this podcast and Taryn's channel and resource on the internet, I want to go on this kind of journey for the perfect sound, so to say, or the perfect sonic experience, whatever we want to call it.
Absolutely. I think we're all on that journey. And it's great to have you here, and I really appreciate you supporting me on Patreon and also agreeing to be a regular contributor on here. And like I say, we can look at things from your perspective, which I think will be of real value to viewers. So let's start from where you're at currently along your journey. What have you got? What's your system, and what are you looking to do?
All right. Yeah. So I have a beginning system, as I would like to call it. Mm-hmm. I have an ELAC bookshelf debut 6.2 speakers that is powered by an NAD amplifier or a NAD amplifier, the workhorse C316B BEE V2. It's too many letters in there. I could get them all mixed up, but I'm pretty sure everyone knows the one that I'm referring to. And I have a SHIT Modi 3 DAC that acts as a source. And I have a Raspberry Pi connected as a USB source. And I also have an optical cable coming in from my smart TV. So sometimes if I play like Spotify or Amazon Music, I use the optical out going into the DAC and going to the speakers through the NAD. And it's my first system. I wanted to, do it on a budget. And then eventually, in the last 2 years, I think I have reached a stage where I'm saying, okay, what's the next step? So that's the kind of position I'm in right now.
So is that in your living room?
So that's not in my living room. So we we have an entertainment center room, which is a small room. I would say it's about 10 feet by 12 feet. It's about 120 square feet. So it's an entertainment center room. I forget the feet to meters conversion. What is it? What would that be?
So 10 feet is just over 3 meters, and what you say 12 feet is 4 meters. So just over 3 by 4. So it's kind of like a it's a small to medium-sized room on that side.
Right.
Not too small. Yeah. Okay. And what's been your experience with that particular system?
So that system, I do find that I don't know. Maybe for instance, only after I've encountered the British audiophile channel have I actually started paying attention to where I position the speakers. So maybe we should, talk about that a little bit. I had them first against the wall, trying to optimize for space, and it wasn't as enjoyable as it is now, because after watching your 101 series, I ensured that I, have them positioned in, of course, the biggest constraint is the room, but as optimal as possible for that setting. And I felt that the speakers opened up a lot more. There was a lot more mass. There was a lot more body because of the way it's positioned now.
So what did you do specifically with the positioning? Did you change the positioning by moving them out from the walls?
Right. Yeah. So I made sure they're at least 1.5 feet away from the walls. First step. And then I also ensured that there was always good distance from the side wall. It was about 90 centimeters, again, about 1.5 feet, or almost 3 feet, sorry, from the side walls. But I made sure that they're at least 1.5 feet away from the back wall.
Right. Okay.
So maybe that's one thing. So if you were to advise a fledgling audiophile about where to position the speakers, how would you go about that kind of best practices tips?
Yeah, so I did a video which was fairly comprehensive in terms of what you should look for and what you should listen for. So distance from walls primarily is a bass control, and then the distance apart from each other, you want to try and have fairly close to an equilateral triangle. So the distance between the two speakers is similar to the distance from yourself. Some people like to be a bit further away than that, but that's generally what I consider to be fairly optimal. And speaker distance, that will determine, there's only a certain amount of flexibility that people have within a room anyway with positioning. But if you can ideally get them somewhere between 2 and 4 meters, that's what, 6 to 10 feet, 6 to 12 feet, depending on the size of the room. Obviously your room's smaller, so they're going to be closer to, on the more like 2 meters apart, and sitting similar distance away from them, then you're going to hear much more direct sound rather than reverberant sound. As you go further away from the speakers, the room becomes more and more of a factor. And I think the things that I want to speak about rooms are that there's a trend at the moment with certainly reviewers, and people look at their rooms and they're sometimes acoustically treated with panels everywhere. And a lot of people think, well, actually, I can't do that. I don't have the flexibility to be able to position the speakers so far away. I see the speakers sometimes 1/3 of the way into the room, and all these panels everywhere. And they kind of give up. They think, well, actually, I may as well just stick with what I've got. And the reality is that actually most living spaces make fairly good listening spaces, and this trend to move towards a lot of acoustic treatment, I'm not saying it's not beneficial. It is beneficial if it's done correctly by someone who knows what they're doing. But there's, rooms make fairly good listening spaces because there's quite a lot of furniture and things in room that absorb reflection. So the actual overall reverb time in a room is generally pretty good. In a studio, you want it very, very good because they're trying to hear every single minute detail. They're not listening for enjoyment. They're listening to almost surgical precision. Most people, so there's something called the RT60 time, which is the amount of reverb time it takes for the signal to drop by 60 dBs. And in a studio, that RT60 times, so in a studio, that RT60 time is likely to be something around 0.2 to 0.3 seconds. Most listening spaces are, so that's, and they have to use a lot of acoustic treatment because a studio is a workspace, a bit like your office there, and they have to put that treatment in because there's not naturally going to be a huge amount of soft furnishings and other furniture to absorb a lot of that reverberation. Most living spaces, especially bedrooms, but even living spaces, your main living spaces downstairs will likely to have quite a lot of furniture, and the reverb time, if it's somewhere, most people's listening preference will be somewhere around half a second reverb time, the RT60 time, maybe up to 0.7 seconds. Once you get to an RT60 time of around a second, that's where the actual, intelligibility of vocals becomes more of an issue and things like that. So I just want to talk about that people, my key message here is that the room is important. It does have the most influence on the sound, but this trend to put panels everywhere, they are beneficial if they're done correctly and you know what you're doing, but they're not always necessary in most listening spaces if you get your speakers positioned right and you have some flexibility about where you can position yourself in relation to the speakers. Positional EQ is what that's called, and that is by far the most important thing to get right.
All right. So yes, I think
a little bit to digest there.
We should. Right, but I think if we will link the video that you just alluded to on this podcast video, so that people can get a little revision of that how to just set up the speakers, and you go into more detail there as well, right? So you can just
Yes.
In fact, I used that and I found out that the sonic experience was significantly better. It was quite a shift from what I was used to. The timing was very clear. The sound was more present. It was very subtle, but in some sense, it was a kind of a full body experience in some sense, right? It's going from extremely suboptimal to somewhat optimal for that room. Just that with the same equipment itself made a huge difference. So even before I upgrade equipment, just upgrading the positioning, got that next step already.
Yeah, that's 70% of the job really, is to get the position right, and basically getting them away from walls will make sure that those early reflections are delayed by around 5 milliseconds. So you want to have them ideally, if you're measuring from the front of baffle, you want ideally to have a distance of around 3 feet, just under a meter away from side walls and the wall behind the speakers, and that delays those early reflections, which cleans up the sound quite a bit. Obviously, the distance from the walls affects the bass the most, so you think of it as a bass control. And then the toe-in of the speakers, which is whether the speakers are pointed directly to you or passing by your shoulders, that is more of a treble control. And I think if people follow those general rules, you're not going to get it perfect. I don't have them perfect in my room either. There are certain limitations that my room places, and but there's some people with a lot more experience than me, and even Floyd Toole, who, if anybody who's very analytical and is interested in the science, Floyd Toole wrote the book on how to design speakers and how they interact in rooms, and his advice was always that that even acoustic treatment panels should be used sparingly and sensibly, and there are some rules. That's perhaps something that we'll explore in future topics, specifically about what panels should be used for what. I'm not saying they're not beneficial. It's just there's too much of a big deal made out about the fact that if you don't have them, then you can't really have good sound, and that isn't the case. Get the speaker position right, get your listener position right, and you'll be good to go. So your next step is to want to upgrade your system, isn't it?
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at, and I think some of the options that you have mentioned through your reviews before kind of popped up. So you've done a review of the Hagel H95, haven't you? Would you not say that would that be the next? Would that be a logical next step? But maybe we should talk about my musical preferences first, or something like that. How does this? How do you think you would go about helping me select my next system?
Well, I think the thing is that most people generally, unless they have a leaning particularly, I mean, we've discussed this before, obviously via Patreon, so I know what your listening preferences are to some extent, but my general advice would be that when you're starting out is to try and have a fairly well-balanced system. It might be that later down the line, when you know exactly, it's a journey of learning, and it's like developing your palate for wine or food or anything else. Once you kind of know your sound and what you like and what you don't like more, then you tend to try and tailor it more towards a particular set of priorities. So my general advice to people starting out with their first or second systems is to just have something that's fairly well balanced, that does everything really well, rather than something that does particular things exceptionally well and a couple of other areas where it may suffer a little bit, but perhaps aren't so much of a priority. You need to know what you like and what your sound is. And unless you said to me, Taron, all I listen to is one genre of music in this particular way, I would suggest to have a fairly well-balanced system. And then the second thing is that I generally advocate to people not to upgrade in bite sizes. So you've got some very good components that are fairly accessible. So it's a nice, what most people, I don't like the term entry level, because what's entry level to one person may not be entry level to another. But you've got a nice system that perhaps is accessible to a number of people, which perhaps here in the UK would cost the best part of £1,000. The ideal, what you want to try and achieve, is to have no real weak links in that system as you upgrade. So everything is at a similar level of performance. And
right.
you could double your money. You could spend £1,500 and £2,000 on a system. I'm talking in pounds. You'd be talking in dollars. But
sure,
you could double your money and you'd get incremental improvements. But sometimes, for example, let me take two amplifiers that are fairly well known and well reviewed. The IOTA VX SA3 that retails here for £400. That would be an upgrade from your NADC 316BE. It'll be a little bit cleaner, a little bit more dynamic sounding, and you'll get a marginal improvement. But the right likelihood is you'll have to sell your amplifier secondhand and buy that. And for what you're spending, you're gonna soon. Most people will soon find out that actually it's got a little bit better, but that's you wind up wanting to change again relatively soon. And unless you're that type of user who likes to churn gear through very quickly and is prepared to take the financial consequences of selling secondhand, and normally you're buying new, my advice generally is not to do that. Is not to go from a £200 amplifier to a £400 amplifier. The Hagel is a big jump up. Hagel H95 here is £1,500. So I don't know what the NAD is. It's probably £300, let's say.
The NAD, approximately, because I bought it for, I think, $450 or something like that. So about 325 pounds.
Yeah, so that's a big jump. My advice generally is to people to treble their outlay, but the NAD the Hagel H95 shouldn't necessarily be thought of as a £1,500 amplifier, because it has a very good inbuilt DAC and a streaming module. Even though the streaming module is relatively basic, I think of that more like a £1,000 amplifier with added features, which justifies its outlay. It's one of the best all-rounders for the money. But if you were buying a pure amplifier that didn't have the streaming capability and the quality of DAC that had, it'd be more like a £1,000 amplifier. So it's replacing two components. It's replacing your ship Modi as well as replacing the NAD amplifier that you have. And there's night and day difference. The object you won't realize its full potential until you've upgraded speakers to a similar level. And the advice is the same. You don't change the ELAC. Which are the ones that you have? The ELAC model.
I have the debut 6.2, I think.
The 6.2s, yeah. So you wouldn't
change.
I wouldn't necessarily. Yeah. So I wouldn't necessarily. I would look at something. You could change them for the unifies, which are better, and you would notice an improvement. Speakers have more dramatic improvements, but I've listened to the unifies, and they're harder to drive. The Hagel will drive them pretty well, but I would probably look at something like the KEF LS50 Metas, which are more resolving than the unifies, even though they're perhaps
I do have an interesting point, because briefly when we spoke before this podcast, I was saying that, hey, Taron, I got this interesting deal where I got the KEF LS50 wireless for just $1,000 because they were trying to get rid of their inventory because the LS50 wireless 2s are coming in. And you immediately told me, that's a bargain. Go for it. If you still have the option, go for it. And I got it. And then we spoke briefly again after that. I was telling you, wow, the speakers that I have, and basically at that point, I was looking for a soundbar alternative to our living room space for general entertainment consumption. And instead of getting a soundbar, I thought, why not get something hi-fi, because both my wife and I, we enjoy good sound, good quality. And then you were telling me, yeah, that's a good deal, go get it. And as soon as that happened, I got it and I came back to you. I was telling you, wow, the difference is amazing between the ELACs, which I've been listening to for the last 24 months. And just in one album, I could tell that the difference was infinitely different. I mean, infinitely is of course, very thrown around word, very informally, but it was extremely different. And you were kind of teasing me saying, hey, you're starting to use all these audiophile terms of imaging and all these things, right? So yeah, that was so I do understand the point that you made, which is that the loudspeakers are the most noticeable difference that you can get.
Yeah, these upgrade rules, and it's just, we're talking about rule of thumb very generally here. It served me well. Whenever I've upgraded incrementally, I've always after a little while felt, actually, do you know what? It's a little bit better, but I'm not really that satisfied, and I've had to do it again. And then I wish I'd done. I wish I'd just taken the leap, waited a little bit longer, taken the leap, and got exactly what I wanted. And the KEF LS50 wireless is, in a different league to what your system is, and it's a different price point, and you had the opportunity to buy it for less than half of what it retailed for here. Something like 40%.
Right.
You got 60% off the retail value of what it was in the UK. It's a no-brainer. You go with that. It's and then that will become the new benchmark, and then it solves a lot of problems. And you don't have to worry about amplification and a lot of other things as well.
The DAC is all in there. Yeah, one distinct, noticeable thing that both my wife and I, we kind of exchanged looks when we were listening to the LS50s, were that there's one specific album that we enjoy, and at this point, I think we're talking about music as well. It's guitar as the lead instrument, and it has a percussion and another string accompaniment to it. This is Indian classical music. The most amazing thing that we noticed is that in the ELACs, we never heard the level of detail that we did in the LS50s. And I can speak to one specific point as well, because the guitar, when the artist plays one specific riff, when the musician plays one specific riff, there is one place where we can hear his fingers move across the fretboard. The ELACs never picked that up, but you could hear that level of natural detail in the LS50s, because obviously in the recording that has been picked up, but I've heard that album so many times, and in that position, we were like, wow, that you can even hear the fretboard noise being made by the musician as he slides across, which we would only listen to in a live concert in a controlled auditorium. So yeah, I thought that was a revealing experience.
Yeah, no, it's a significant upgrade, and you grow with your system. That's the other thing. So what will happen is you'll get used to that system, and you'll get used to listening for these different traits, and it's a growth process. You'll start thinking, well, actually, this recording is good, and you'll notice now which recordings you find that there'll be other stuff that you listen to on your old system that all sounded great, and now some of it will sound really good, and other things won't sound quite as good. It won't take you to the same heights. So you'll start to listen for specific things. We all hear roughly in the same way, but you train your ears to pick up certain things like these audiophile terms that I band around, which I'm sure some people wonder what I'm talking about sometimes, but that's the growth process. And once you figure that out, then there's the next step of your journey, but you can't rush the process.
Yeah. And let's talk about one more thing that I wanted to kind of ask is you do go over a lot of technical insights, and I'm sure a good percentage of the audience and the manufacturers especially appreciate it. But maybe we can use this forum to, especially when I come on, to kind of clarify some of those things. So, for instance,
Absolutely.
for today's topic, let me ask you one thing. So many times you talk about the bass is fast. So when I'm listening, and the only hi-fi system that I have listened to is through my ELACs, so that's my reference frame, and then I go to the LS50s. Can you give me an example? Because especially you've talked about some of the tracks that you use when you're auditioning a system, and I know the jazz album. For some reason, that name is slipping my mind, but Kind of Blue,
Kind
I
of Blue,
think, right?
Kind of Blue, yeah, Miles
Kind
Davis.
of Blue
That's
jazz album,
yeah.
flamenco sketches, classic piece and all that. And you describe very vividly about the imaging in your video, and it's, I think, really well done. We should link that also to this podcast. But so when you say fast bass and with flamenco sketches as a baseline, let's say if you have to tell a fledgling audiophile, hey, this is the point, and in this piece, this place is what I'm referring to as fast bass. I think because you say this tight bass, fast bass, these expressions, somehow, I mean, I guess there are quite a few people obviously who get it, but when I watch that, I gloss over those details. But that's probably something that you're trying to communicate. And if I were to ask you, what do you mean by that? How would you answer that question?
Well, that's something which you picked one which is perhaps a little bit contentious, because fast bass is a term that audiophiles use. Now, in terms of recording studios, if you're talking it in pure technical terms, bass frequencies actually propagate in a room slightly slower than the rest of the other frequency range. So the pro audio community always say, what the hell is he talking about fast bass for? There's no such thing as fast bass, and technically they are correct. What I'm really referring to is the definition of that bass. Okay, so if there's a lot of quick percussive transients, how clearly and how well defined they are. And this is a trait that particularly separates out a lot of hi-fi systems. A lot of systems, we talked about the room, and the position of the speakers and the position of the person relative to the speakers are the most critical things to get right. So that's a given. If you haven't got that right, there's no way you're going to get clear bass definition. You'll be sitting in a place where either the speakers generating resonances and booming, what they call a peak, bass peak. So you need to have that bit. That's why we covered that. I wanted to cover that initially. So assuming you've got the position right and your listening position, and you're not sitting where the bass is resonating in the room, so it's not your room resonating, there's something that distinguishes one speaker from another, is how well defined those percussive bass transients are. Now, Kind of Blue is a track that I use for judging tonality, imaging, and extension in bass, because it has a double bass playing that goes down. It's one of the few instruments that goes down to around 40 hertz, a grand piano, pipe organ. There's not many instruments that go down that low. And I use it to judge stereo soundstage and imaging, because there's 5 or 6 players there, and you can easily make out the 5 or 6 players. So it's a question of how well you can work out their positioning. It's great for that. It's very good for judging tonality, because it has 3 instruments which are acoustic instruments that are extremely difficult to reproduce: a saxophone, a trumpet, and a grand piano. And you'd be surprised as to how many high-end systems fail to reproduce those correctly. So it's great for judging tone. The bass plays very low, and most speaker systems, unless they're supplemented by a subwoofer, will struggle to get the variation as he's playing on that bass. It'll just sound like he's playing one note. It's what they call one-note bass. And so it's very good at just judging those tonal variations in the bass. But in terms of fast bass, which I refer to, which I'm really, that's a lay term for saying definition and how tight that bass is, there's other tracks that I use. For example, there's another jazz track. I don't always use jazz tracks, but they're very good at picking out differences because they only, like I say, no, if you've got a jazz quartet, there's only 4 instruments. So Dave Brubeck is another standard that's used, and there's an album, very famous album called Take 5. The title track from that has a fairly percussive bass line. He goes for it a little bit on those bass drums. So that's much better at judging bass definition on what you call mid bass. So I'm not talking about the double bass that plays very low. I'm talking about where drums hit from 50 to 100 hertz. And the other thing that's probably excellent for someone who listens to Indian classical music like me is the tabla. That is the fastest percussive instrument there is, sometimes over 200 beats a minute. And when they're going for it on an Indian classical piece with the tabla, if you can hear the hits of those percussively, then you know you've got something that's very well defined in the bass.
And I can speak to that primarily because the album that I was just talking about a little earlier actually has a percussion instrument like the tabla. It's a South Indian version of that called the mridangam. And the difference between the ELAC, where I would feel, it's the whole system, so I shouldn't just blame it on, or just point out the ELAC, not blame or anything. Point out the ELAC or the amplifier or the DAC specifically. But successive beats of the mridangam would roll over one another in the ELAC system, whereas when I was able to play that same track on the KEF, I could hear the distinctness in the beats, and especially, I think what the first and foremost thing that hit me the most was imaging. Like the sound was matching identical to where it would come from when you're sitting in a live auditorium, and the accuracy. Especially what happens is there's a drum solo in that piece. So when it comes to the drum solo, he plays like a 2-minute drum solo, the artist, and the definition and the accuracy in which that drum solo was reproduced was much, much better on the KEFs than they were in the ELACs. The main artist who's playing the guitar, I guess there was the details were missing, but overall the sonic experience was still pretty good in the ELACs. But in terms of the drums, and especially you referred to the beats per minute, I found that there was a distinct difference between the two, and the imaging. I think imaging, I keep saying that over and over again because I guess in my journey, that was the first most noticeable things that I could get at in comparing, because it's a live album that was recorded and distributed in an album, right? So it was a live concert. So I've been to that live concert. So for me, it was putting me back in that time capsule and listening to that experience. So listening that again, reliving that experience, which was why I think it resonated with me quite a bit. And I realized that I guess that's a good way to kind of bring in some finishing thoughts to a first episode, is that, well, all these people, when they talk about hi-fi system and people putting in thousands of dollars in, what do they actually mean, right? Sometimes you just start off, you think, oh man, you get a system, you put things together, you have power amplification, it's, get some of the physics and you understand it. But then once you start, it's like a hit of a drug, I guess, in some sense. Now, like immediately you're looking for the next system. Where else can you improve? And the tinkering brain just starts click, 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 click. So, yeah.
The overall fidelity of that KEF system compared to what you have is much greater. So you're hearing a lot more information, and it's capable of, controlling. There's much better control of those speakers. It's an active system as well, which I talked about when I was talking to Ben. We talked about passive and active systems. I've done quite a lot on the channel with passive and active systems, which have a technical advantage. There's a lot of science and engineering involved into how these things work, and measurements reveal an awful lot about what's wrong with systems, but ultimately there's an awful lot of art that goes into it as well. That's where I part company with the hardline objectivists. There's certain things that are very quantifiable and very measurable and very easy to explain, and there's a little bit of alchemy involved as well. Maybe as time goes on, we'll eventually get to the point where there won't be any alchemy involved, but there's an art, and that's why you've taken your system to an entirely different level. You're excited, your enthusiasm is obvious and infectious, and you can see that you're getting a lot of pleasure because you have taken what I would consider the next logical step. And now what you want to do is really try and find out what that system does, what it doesn't do, and eventually as you develop your own listening skills, it's not that you won't hear these skills, you'll be able to pinpoint these things, like you say about imaging, which is the precise location of various instruments within that sound stage. And the KEF is a dual concentric design, and there's certain things about the way in which a dual concentric design works that makes it very good for imaging. And so once you're informed by the science, and you know your system, and you know the sound, and you start to appreciate its strengths, eventually you'll also start to realize it has certain shortcomings. And that's the point where you start thinking, okay, I understand it does this. At the moment, you've got a new system that you love. It's much better than what you have. It's just wow. It's that wow factor, you know.
Yes.
It's like, you know, when you first go on when you get in, well, I've been married for a long time. Let me just reiterate that. When when you're young and you're going on a first date, it's all very exciting, you know, at the beginning.
Exactly.
But, you know, you need to live. You need to be with someone for a little while before you fully appreciate what they bring to the party, and that's how it is with a system. You live with that for a while, and get comfortable with it. Find out what it does, what it doesn't, and you'll start through that process to learn what you feel is missing. And it's when you know, that's when you upgrade with an idea, you're getting then to the point where you're talking about a couple of grand's worth of systems. So the next system is, you're talking about £5,000 or £6,000 as a step. Talking, you know, that's a significant chunk of money to invest. So
right.
you want to know what you want to gain from that upgrade. You need to have a goal of what you want to try and achieve. Quite often people chase, you know, they're just chasing the next upgrade or the next highly reviewed product, or it must be better. And you have to always look at it as an entire system and take it to the next level. You might do it in stages. You might decide, actually, you know, I'm not going to go for a one-box solution next time. I'm just going to go for speakers, amplifier, but I want it to do this. So you'll know what components you want, and then that journey will start again. But enjoy what you're doing in the interim.
Excellent.
Yeah,
that's great.
So I think I don't know how long we'll be on, Siddharth. We wanted to keep these relatively short because I think I sometimes go on for an hour and a half. I think we'll pick this up in the next one, I think, from where we left off here. Hopefully viewers have enjoyed this, but I do really appreciate you coming on. I do really appreciate all the support that you give me with Patreon as well, and the fact that
of course,
it's very kind. Yeah,
I think it's excellent content. I think one thing we can do probably is look on some of the comments that appear in the channel, and maybe we both can tease that out in some sense. I can be the novice asking the question, and then we can kind of discuss the answer. And then try to do some of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole purpose of doing this, and that's why I'm very excited to have you on the channel, because you look at this from a fresh pair of eyes, and that brings a lot, I think, to a lot of viewers. So we'll leave it there. I'll just like to thank everybody for watching, and thanks Siddharth for coming on, and we'll see you in the next podcast. Take care. Bye.
All right. Thank you. Bye.